Well, good afternoon and welcome to session 3, a recalibrated U.S. ROK Alliance. This is our first on the record session of the day, and Harry Kazianis assures me that he really does have the technology working, and we're potentially reaching 1.8 million Facebook users. So the pressure is on when you ask a question. I'm joined by 3 good friends here. To my far left is Yoon-Lee, Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies and Assistant Professor. He teaches Korea and U.S. East Asia Relations. He's a representative and a graduate of more schools than I've ever visited. He has been on BBC, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, and many other networks, and in 2013, The Guardian called him among the most insightful and prescient chroniclers.
Clearly mistakenly.
I don't think so. To my immediate left, Bruce Klingner, an old friend from the Asia Foundation, runs the Asia program, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. For them, he's a veteran of 20 years of distinguished service in the intelligence community, so clearly a man who knows of which he speaks. Doug Bandow, another frequent visitor to the national interest, a frequent contributor to our journals. Once worked for President Ronald Reagan, which sounds almost quaint to even mention that now, but showing our age. Holds a JD from Stanford University and also a frequent visitor on the news chat programs now. Our subject is a recalibrated U.S. ROK Alliance, and our presence in Korea has been much discussed of late, particularly with the cancellation of exercises and things. And our actual troop presence there is something that's perhaps more often discussed than understood. It started obviously in 1950. We went from absolutely zero presence there. Lord have always surveyed in Asia. Korea was intentionally left out of what we considered our security perimeter until Kim Il-sung, the first of the great Kims, invaded South Korea in June of 1950. President Truman made the decision to rush troops there. We were initially unprepared for this, having done a precipitous and damaging demobilization after 1945, but it was a war of up the peninsula, back down, back up about halfway again, and settled out where we are now along the 38th parallel. Over time, our presence has adjusted along with the development of the capabilities of the Republic of Korea, where before the image was that we had thousands of troops poised with fixed bayonets on the inter-Korean border. That's not the case anymore. The Koreans have more divisions along the demilitarized zone than we have in the entire U.S. Armed Forces, so they bear the brunt of the ground combat, at least initially. Our role over time has devolved to being able to synchronize combat capabilities among the different realms of air, land, and sea, space, and cyber now, and being able to provide power projection forces that provide an ability to invade North Korea without having to go overland through the most fortified border in the history of the planet. A unique feature of the alliance is something called the Combined Forces Command, where it has to be experienced to really be appreciated. U.S. and ROK personnel not sharing the same duties, but interspersed in primary billets throughout the entire staff. The first OPCON change was in the early 90s when the Koreans requested a change to where they would have operational control in DEFCON conditions 5 and 4, and the United States would assume control in DEFCON 3. Prior to that, it was the U.S. in control all the time. This is perhaps a harbinger of occasional OPCON control discussions that have gone on since then. The air and sea presence that the United States can bring to Korea in the event of a conflict is one aspect of our presence there. The other aspect is the backbone of synchronization, the command control, communications, and those types of things that allow us to synchronize our actions. We're outnumbered by North Korea, so our forte, our counter to that is deep and efficient and agile synchronization of the combat capabilities between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. And this means, in practical terms, the integration of maneuver, fires, and effects across an alliance in real time. To put it in the vernacular, it means Koreans shooting in support of American troops who are engaged with North Korea and vice versa. And it works. It's the only place where we are that deeply integrated with an integrated command. This is under question now. The part of the agreement that President Trump proposed to Kim Jong-un, of course, was that we would suspend or postpone, or whatever term you want to put on it, major exercises that we use twice a year to ensure that each person who participates in this knows how the synchronization works and knows what their role is. Synchronization or the loss of one exercise is probably not critical, but it does start a trend, and that's something that's going to be a question here as we go forward. And we heard some commentary earlier about how this might be resolved. With that, let me turn to our panel, and we can start in the order in which people were introduced. And Sung, after you, please.
Thank you very much. Is the mic on?
You are.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity. Scripture teaches us not to covet thy neighbor. But in the reality of international politics, Korea's neighbors have always coveted the Korean Peninsula and still do, quite passionately. When you look at the roughly 60-year period leading up to the outbreak of the Korean War, as the General mentioned, in June 1950, I count 5 major wars in and around the Korean Peninsula. Whereas if you look at the 65 years since the signing of the armistice on July 27, 1953, I count 0, no wars. It's been de facto peace, prolonged peace in and around the Korean Peninsula. I think at the top of historical causes, were you to build a hierarchy of causes, you would have to list probably the hard work, the determination of the Korean people at the very top. Whereas, if you were to try to explain the causes of South Korea's security, again, no war, unstable peace, but de facto peace for more than 6 decades, you would have to put the U.S. ROK Alliance at the very top of your hierarchy of historical causes. So the question becomes, why tamper with such a good thing? When we talk about recalibration, we don't necessarily mean the abrogation of the alliance, but it is the first step to downgrading the alliance, in my humble estimation. The last time that there was a great gap in perspectives between Washington and Seoul with respect to the nature of the North Korean regime and its intentions, its nuclear strategy, the fissure, the tension in the alliance was quite palpable. I know institutional memory is quite thin, but it wasn't all that long ago when people were actually quite worried about the alliance falling apart because South Korea and the United States had such differing views of North Korea's intentions. In fact, I remember Scott Snyder and I participated in a major conference on an alternative future, a world without the U.S. ROK Alliance. Of course, no one is seriously talking about the termination of the alliance, but recalibration, downgrading the alliance, popcorn transfer, wartime control, all these will pave the way for downgrading and weakening the alliance, which is, in my view, detrimental to South Korea's security, its long-term policy, even it has economic implications. The U.S. role in Korea is not just to deter North Korea, but it's quite manifold in complementing South Korea's weaknesses, comparative disadvantages. South Korea suffers from a set of shortfalls on basic security needs like reconnaissance, intelligence gathering capabilities, early warning analysis, control command, of course, even special forces operation capabilities. To give you one example, in 1996, North Korean commandos infiltrated South Korea. They came via submarine, and it took the South Korean military 2 divisions almost 3 months to capture and kill 26 North Koreans. So the glaring insecurity that might ensue in the wake of, if not the termination, then the downgrading of the alliance will put South Korea at a security disadvantage. But more importantly, as South Korea contemplates giving North Korea more and more concessions, a peace declaration or a peace treaty, which of course will call into question the very raison d'etre of the U.S. ROK Alliance and the stationing of U.S. troops in South Korea. Why are they there if you have a peace treaty between the U.S. and North Korea? Who will be asking those questions? North Koreans, of course, but also South Koreans and Americans. All these concessions that the South Korean government is seriously contemplating today have long-term negative implications because these concessions may be helpful in continuing the warm atmospherics of rapprochement in the Korean Peninsula. But the presumption behind these plans are quite illogical in my view, in that they presume other neighbors in the region to be passive bystanders. For example, if there were to be a regime instability situation in North Korea, which seems quite unlikely at the moment, if there is internal chaos or war in North Korea, if there is to be unification, how would China act? Were the U.S. ROK Alliance to be far weaker than it is today? How would Japan respond? For Japan, the emergence of a hostile, independent Korean state, hostile toward Japan, is a nightmare scenario. And I think one can assume that Japan will be even more bent on strengthening its alliance with the United States were that unpromising eventuality to take place. For China, the reason that China maintains good relations with South Korea are quite complex, but for South Korea, without the bedrock, the spine, the backbone of the U.S. support, South Korea's clout will be quite weak in shaping its own future vis-a-vis its overwhelmingly bigger neighbors. When the Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River and managed to compel their foes to retreat south, recapturing Pyongyang and Seoul and further down south in 1593, I refer to the Imjin Wars, or Hideyoshi's invasions, a major war as it was, international war in the late 1500s. The Chinese probably did not realize that their attempt to deter the Japanese invaders from crossing over into China would presage their decline and collapse. And less than 50 years later, the Ming Dynasty collapsed. The Koreans, of course, did not realize that Chinese intervention, which saved Korea, would also have negative implications in terms of the rise of the Manchu, whom the Korean king discarded as barbarian, and that led to very deadly 2 serious Manchu invasions of Korea in 1627 and 1636. Why do I refer to that war more than 400 years ago? Because the Korean War and the Imjin War have compelling, striking similarities in presaging the vicissitudes of national fortune. The past 65 years of prosperity and peace cannot be presumed to last forever. And if North Korea were to be emboldened, armed with nuclear weapons, as it is today, with credible continual threat capability in terms of nuking a major US city, I think the prospects for continued peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula would be further compromised. Why? because in my view, North Korea is fundamentally a revisionist state. A revisionist state bent on maximalist intentions. That is a polite way of saying uniting the Korean Peninsula, obliterating the far more successful, attractive Korean state across the border with which it has to contend forever, and enforcing peace on its terms as the head, as the official seat of government being in Pyongyang or Seoul, in the wake of the reunification, the communist reunification of the Korean Peninsula. I think this is not a pipe dream for North Korea. It's an unnegotiable proposition for North Korea. So I know people have different views on North Korea's intentions and capabilities, and perhaps North Korea is paranoid, fearful of the United States, and if the US and South Korea were to be gentler, kinder, and really give North Korea whatever it asks for, perhaps real peace could be maintained for another half century or century. But my views are quite to the contrary. I think the danger of war only increases with greater concessions, and I think we have to really take seriously into consideration the probability, in my view, that the dynamics today, one of rapprochement and diplomatic negotiations, while it's to be favored over any war or preemptive strike, the dynamics come with grave consequences, grave implications, in that they allow North Korea to buy time and money with which to really do what it seeks, which is to continue to advance its lethal capabilities, so that one day Kim Jong-un will be able to complete his own nuclear posture review with which to threaten the United States, Japan, and South Korea, really bullying, emasculating, isolating, censoring South Korea, and uniting the Korean Peninsula on its own terms, all by name. So as we consider, in closing, recalibrating the alliance, I know I am not disagreeable to the view that the United States should withdraw some troops to send a complex signal to both South Korea and North Korea. But I think one has to be quite cautious, because if the United States were fundamentally okay with abrogating the alliance, so be it. But I think we'll have a replay of 1949, 1950, when the US, for not uncoveting, that's not a word I don't think, but because the United States did not desire South Korea after having governed it for 3 years, 45 to 48, when the United States withdrew by the summer of 1949, war took place less than a year later, and the US came back and paid a huge price for that. So I think any recalibration or downgrading the alliance or the withdrawal of US troops from the Korean Peninsula probably would entail grave consequences for US security interests as well, for it is not in the long-term interest of the United States to stand by and to allow the communization of the Korean Peninsula. And once the Kim family is able to achieve that long-cherished goal, then I don't think we can expect the Kim dynasty to moderate its behavior and behave as a conventional nuclear armed state, but its threats to Japan and to US interests will only increase, in my humble view. Thank you.
Professor Sung, thank you very much. Some years ago, a good Asian friend grew frustrated with me and said, the problem with you Americans is you look at everything that happens as a dot, something that's discrete in time and space, solvable, independent of anything else, where we in Asia look at everything as being part of a line. And Professor Sung has demonstrated that what we're dealing with today is indeed part of a long line going back 5, 6 centuries there, and we ignore those dynamics at our peril. Bruce, the challenge is yours now.
Right. One lesson that I always try to remember, and I always fail to, is never follow my good friend Professor Lee on a panel or congressional testimony, given his eloquence and his memory. So as he was speaking, I was desperately trying to think of something so I could start with Well, as St. Paul wrote in his letter to the Ephesians, but my memory isn't as good as his, so instead I'll just sort of plod along in my own way. We're focused on the alliance now, and I think it's worthwhile just to point out what is the obvious, that an alliance has several aspects. It has the obvious military aspect, but it also has diplomatic and political aspects. The diplomatic is that the military is part of or should be part of a comprehensive integrated strategy. It's not a tool in and of itself. It is there to achieve political objectives. So, as Frederick the Great was reported to have said, is that diplomacy without force is like music without instruments. You can't do it. And more recently, General Mattis had said, "I come in peace. I didn't bring artillery with me, but I'm pleading with you with tears in my eyes." And I'm sure General Gregson is cringing that I'm going to complete that quote, but I will just paraphrase call sign chaos and just say, if you disagree with me strongly, I will be forced to resort to military means in order to achieve U.S. strategic objectives. I think that's about what General Mattis said, but in quite a different way.
Let the record so state.
So anyway, it just shows that the alliances are not there simply for military purposes. They are part of a comprehensive U.S. policy. The political aspect, I think, is what is really perhaps too often focused on in discussions in Washington. So when we talk about how is the alliance with South Korea, we're looking more at the political partnership or the political relationship rather than the alliance itself. So right now, when there are perhaps indications of a growing rift or disagreements between Washington and Seoul over policy towards North Korea, sometimes in the media or at conferences we'll say, well, how is this going to impact the alliance? Is this going to strain the alliance? And I'd say it's worthwhile just to really emphasize the difference between the political aspect and the military aspect. So one military topic which will, I think, take on political ramifications is whether we resume military exercises. And that General Mattis or Secretary Mattis made some comments today which I think are kind of already being misinterpreted. So it's if the diplomacy with North Korea isn't going well, what happens with next March, April's large-scale military exercise? Do we hold off on them, or do we resume them, and what impact will that have not only on the diplomacy with North Korea, but also perhaps the relationship with South Korea? Turning to the military aspect of it, I'd say the alliance right now is very, very strong. Oftentimes at conferences we'll be trying to come up with ideas for new capabilities or new ideas. And I would just emphasize a lot of really smart people in the Pentagon as well as in South Korea and Tokyo have all been looking at the North Korean threat as well as the Chinese threat. So I think things are doing pretty well. And certainly North Korean action of the last number of years, particularly the 2 attacks in 2010, had the effect of really emphasizing and refocusing people's attention. So right now, in response to North Korean contingencies, we have Op Plan 5015 for responding to a full-scale invasion. We have Con Plan 5029 for dealing with 8 or 10 or so scenarios. And then we have the counter-provocation contingency plan, which is dealing with things like the 2010 attacks or the landmine incident. So it's really very good, well-thought-out plans at really the strategic, the operational, and the tactical levels. Now, that's not to say there's still a number of issues that need to be focused on and perhaps could even be contentious. And I'll lay out 9 of them. The first would be South Korea's ongoing defense reform program. Just this week, we've seen headlines of North Korea increasing defense spending, for this DRP 2.0. Now, some people have sort of seen this as new. President Moon's trying to, decrease the military capabilities of South Korea and therefore the military or the alliance. But really, this has been going on for quite some time, really since No Mu-hun. Back then it was DRP 2020 because it was going to be completed by the year 2020. And then when South Korea underfunded it, it slipped to 2025. And then we had DRP 2030. And then it went through other names, 307 and 1230, et cetera. And so now I guess the latest name is 2.0. basically what it's responding to is demographics where by the year 2020 or 2025, South Korea won't have enough 18-year-olds to fill the military as it's deployed now. So the idea was, as you decrease the quantity of your military, and they were going to go from 625,000 down to 515,000 or 500,000, you would then offset that by improving or increasing the quality of your military, including capabilities. And the problem has always been underfunding it. So anyway, we'll continue to watch how the current South Korean president sort of continues, augments, changes the defense reform plan, but it is something that has been going on for some time. The second aspect would be the increased defense spending. We just saw articles today that they're looking for pretty robust increase in defense spending. They lay out the areas where it will be devoted to. And so I think with that, the focus, that or analytic focus, should be on, are they buying the right things? Are they trying to, in essence, duplicate capabilities that the U.S. is already bringing to the alliance? Are they, like many militaries, going for the flashy objects of new fighter planes and things, rather than going for the less sexy but perhaps more important things, such as ISR, communications, even ammo, where we are woefully inadequately supplied, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but really worldwide. So buying a whole package for a weapon system, not just the flashy thing with shiny hubcaps. The third aspect would be ballistic missile defense. Clearly that is something that is of grave importance, given North Korea's not only ICBMs, which can attack the U.S., but the No-Dong and the Scud missiles that can hit Japan and South Korea. So right now, South Korea has Patriot 2s. They are working on a medium and long-range surface-to-air missile systems themselves, the MSAM and the LSAM. Those won't be deployed for many years, and neither of those is as capable as the U.S. THAAD system. So the U.S. deployed a battery, I guess last year, although it's been out of the news, but apparently there's sort of obstructions in actually building the base for, or the deployment site for that, due to obstruction by protesters. So that, even though it's out of the news, is something that I think we need to keep focused on. Another aspect of South Korean missile defense is sea-based missiles. Right now, the North Koreans are working on submarine-launched ballistic missiles for which South Korea has no defenses. The SM-2, or Standard Missile 2, currently deployed on their Aegis ships, have anti-ship missile capability, but no anti-ballistic missile capability. So once North Korea deploys an SLBM, South Korea's flanks will be totally exposed to a potentially nuclear SLBM attack. So South Korea has been looking into procuring the SM-3 or SM-6, which does have an anti-BMD capability. Another issue on missile defense is integrating the independent Korean air and missile defense system with the allied, i.e. U.S. and Japan system, which Seoul has always refused to do given historic problems. And I think that's, it's sacrificing South Korea's security for really political or historic issues. It's like a baseball manager saying, I don't want my three outfielders talking to each other. Yes, I know that if you have three different viewpoints and you're communicating, that you're more likely to catch the ball or intercept the missile, but I'd rather sacrifice efficiency for historic issues, so I think that's a mistake. Fourth issue, OPCON transfer. There are both military and political aspects to that. The military, as General Gregson was pointing out, it's to have South Korea achieve the capabilities so that they can attain wartime operational command of their own forces, which right now shifts to the UN commander, who's always been a U.S. general. So South Korea progressive presidents Roh Moo-hyun and Moon Jae-in have seen it as a political issue of gaining term goal of the alliance in the United States, but you don't want to do it prematurely for political reasons. And just, I think last week, General Brooks said South Korea is not yet ready to assume wartime OPCON. Also, it has a procurement aspect in that South Korea shouldn't devote money to reproduce or replicate systems or capabilities the U.S. already is bringing to the table, because the alliance won't go away after OPCON transfer. We will be there, although in a supporting, not supported role. A fifth issue is the burden sharing agreement or special measures agreement. Negotiations are going on now between the two countries. They're always contentious because they're dealing with money. And it seems behind the scenes they're perhaps even more contentious. There's some indications that the U.S. is asking for double what South Korea has been providing so far, and South Korea is pushing back on that. So I hope that issue doesn't become political, and that is really just kind of behind the scenes arguing, and then they come up with some number. But a sixth issue, which could complicate that and others, would be President Trump's comments about the alliance. We've seen during the campaign and even more recently, very negative comments about allies, sort of ungrateful, freeloading, spendthrift allies. And we saw during the campaign very critical comments about South Korea and Japan. And then even more recently, sort of this, well, I'm not going to remove the troops now, but I want to over time. It sort of sounds like Jimmy Carter's pledge to remove all troops back when he was the president. And then cooler heads prevailed. So given that sense, it's led to trepidation not only in Tokyo and Seoul, but in NATO as to sort of maintaining U.S. not only capabilities but resolve. So that's something that has impacted and will continue to impact Allied perceptions of us. A seventh aspect, and kind of one I alluded to before, is trilateral integration or cooperation amongst the U.S., South Korean, and Japanese militaries. I think officers or military officials in all three countries will say that behind the scenes there's a lot more interaction and cooperation than sort of you'd see above the surface, but they have to keep it quiet because of political sensitivities. But it's the kind of thing that not only on missiles, but on things like mine clearing and anti-submarine warfare, there has to be very close coordination, if not integration, amongst the three militaries. And it also gets into, can they perhaps have to do some of those exercises off peninsula or away from the peninsula, so it seems less politically sensitive. Two last ones, and then I'll stop. The eighth one would be, to what degree does the South Korean military stay focused only on the North Korean threat, or to what degree do they look off peninsula, including a blue water navy? They were moving that way before the Cheonan sinking, and then afterwards the Chief of Naval Operations even banned the phrase blue water navy because it returned more to a homeland defense. But as South Korea's capabilities increase, if the North Korean threat were decreased, there'd be a look to have South Korea play a greater role overseas, UN peacekeeping operations, anti-Somali pirate operations, things like that, as they've done in the past. And finally, ninth and finally, I'd say don't lower your guard prematurely. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what we're seeing at a very, very tactical level of removing guard posts along the DMZ. But at a higher level, it would be things like signing a peace declaration or a peace treaty, which I think could lead to a very negative sort of legislative or societal momentum of, well, if the war is over, let's bring the boys home, let's save money, which you wouldn't by deploying them in the U.S., and reducing your defense before you reduce the North Korean conventional threat to South Korea, as well as our forces and our civilians there. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Bruce. Thank you very much. Two things occurred to me in putting Professor Lee's remarks together with Bruce's. One of the things that was not mentioned that's very, very much impacts the Korean military was their democratic transition. And the proficiency of the military increased terrifically as a result of that democratic transition. The reason is that when you have to recruit your forces, you have to get away from attrition tactics. You can't treat the soldiers as an expendable round. That puts it perhaps harshly, but the difference to a periodic outside observer as the Koreans went through this transition to democratic forces was astounding. One small anecdote, my host at one of the exercises in Korea when Tom Hammis and I were much younger, hosted me to a dinner at his house, and he began talking about the Gwangju riots. And he was a classmate from my command and staff class at Quantico. And he, over most of a bottle of scotch, we talked most of the night about how disturbed the officer corps in the Republic of Korea was about the way they were used to suppress their own students in the Gwangju riots. And I remember thinking that this government's not going to last long if that's the attitude, and it didn't. And the proficiency has just gotten much, much better as they went through this. The demographic challenge was raised. Something we might get into in a discussion is this will cause some hard decisions on the recruiting side, because if you're recruiting from a shrinking population, then you have to be able to attract enough people, which means you just have to start talking about what's the benefits. And it's got to be benefits that is not just money, although that's always helpful, but something that allows the service members to enter society at a higher level when they leave the service than perhaps they were when they entered, meaning primarily educational benefits. The SMA agreement, the burden sharing agreement was mentioned. There's always going to be issues within an alliance like this. Anytime troops from one nation are based in another nation, it automatically requires a compromise of the principles of sovereignty on the part of each nation. So the negotiations of all these things are part of the compromise. How are we doing on these negotiations? How's the support doing? Follow the money. Camp Humphreys, which is being built now in the Republic of Korea, is one of the 4 largest post-World War II military construction projects in the world, ever, since World War II. Almost all the money going into Camp Humphreys is Korean money. So while we quibble about other things and how we're going to spend things, this is a major, major advancement for what we're doing. Doug, bring us home.
Well, it's good to be here. It's always good to be at the center. I spent the last roughly week and a half in the Middle East, and I went for almost that entire time not thinking about Korea.
So we're better than Iraq.
Well, maybe, or Syria, where I happened to be. But it is a pleasure to be here. My view is, my role is to be a bit of an agent provocateur. If we're going to be quoting St. Paul, I think I'd quote Corinthians, we see through a glass darkly. Trying to decide what's going to happen on the peninsula, and certainly with North Korea, I think that is a very accurate way of looking at things. Certainly we're living in very interesting times, and it's a good time to debate the Korea issue and to think about fundamentals. I mean, a year ago, it seemed to a lot of people that war threatened. I had people in my church come up to me and ask if we were going to have nuclear war. And I have not been asked that question before, even with the Soviet Union. And these were people who were genuinely scared, intelligent, thoughtful people who were reading the news. 2 months ago, it appeared that we had peace in our time. I just waited for the president to kind of wave the little statement around as he came out of the meeting. We didn't get that gesture, unfortunately. And now, with the latest developments, one wonders, are we headed towards war again? And what we see, I think, dealing with North Korea is this is always going to be a challenge. And it was never going to be as easy as I think our president may have thought. In the midst of all this, the question is what do we do with the U.S. ROK Alliance? And I think that it's odd, in my view, that at least it appears in the thinking of some that people value the alliance more than denuclearization. Because, of course, the issue was raised as to should the question of American troops and potentially the alliance be part of negotiations, and there were a succession of articles and commentary expressing horror at that thought. That is, given the choice, we can have a world in which there are no nuclear weapons in North Korea and no U.S. ROK alliance, or we can have a world in which North Korea has nuclear weapons and there is a U.S. ROK alliance, and we are better off in the latter, which I find kind of astounding, thinking back to last fall, where people were actually talking about the possibility of nuclear war. It never struck me that was likely to happen, but I thought that the dangers were mistake and misapprehension and a number of other things. But to me, that's an odd way of looking at things. And the question is the alliance really worth more than denuclearization? So I think it's a good time to think about the alliance and how it plays into the current situation. It strikes me that alliances should respond to or should reflect the geopolitics of the time. The alliance with the ROK grew out of a very specific time. The end of World War II, midst of the Cold War, concern over the future of NATO, dealing with the Soviet Union, a newly emergent communist power to the north, under somebody who, if we're thinking about nutty characters, it would certainly be Mao Zedong. This is a man, as they were developing nuclear weapons, who announced that who cares if we lose half of our population? We have a lot of people anyway. And if the world, lost half of its people, it'd regenerate. I mean, lots of loony things that would cause lots of concern. And indeed, the U.S. considered nuclear preemption, under both the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations. So the alliance grew out of a very specific, very threatening time, a time in which the Korean Peninsula itself was viewed as important not only for Asia, but frankly for NATO, the question of what would happen if the U.S. did not respond. We had a time of ROK weakness, a time where the Chinese and the Soviets were involved. And of course, all of this is done. All of this is different. All of this is gone. That South Korea looks nothing like it did then. China and Russia look nothing like they did then. I mean, the world is so vastly different. And it strikes me that certainly the most important change is the conventional vulnerability of the South, which is it was utterly, essentially defenseless, almost, I suppose, in 1950, in part because we didn't want to arm our guy because we were afraid how he'd use those weapons. And of course, the Soviets had no compunctions about how they armed Kim Il-sung. Nevertheless, when we talk about inadequacies in the ROK military, these are a matter of choice. I mean, we have to be very blunt about this. The ROK possesses the wherewithal, the resources, the wealth, the ability to create whatever military that it wants. Now, it may, understandably, in my view, it prefers to rely upon the United States. I would too. I've long wished that I could find someone on earth to offload our defense responsibilities, get the French to handle the Atlantic and the Germans to handle NORAD, but probably won't work. Nevertheless, I think we should understand that's what we're talking about here. There's no geographic aspect of the peninsula that says the country to the south can never match militarily the country to the north. It's a matter of choice. And it's an understandable matter of choice as long as the United States is willing to provide military support. The question to my mind then is it in America's interest to do so? And to me, that's one where I think it's much harder to make that argument today. That given the capabilities that the ROK has, why should the U.S. continue to subsidize the ROK? Now, there's a whole set of issues in terms of if one wants to devolve responsibility, if one wants to withdraw, how one does that in a way that's not destabilizing, cooperation with other countries, et cetera. Nevertheless, we should recognize this is a choice the United States has. And there's no reason to assume that an alliance that was created in 1953 must exist and must be maintained in 2018, during which the world has changed dramatically, where everything is vastly different. And I think what's important here is the alliance cannot be viewed in isolation. The United States currently subsidizes a bunch of welfare dependents in Europe. Helpless it appears, even though Italy has a larger economy than Russia. But of course, the Europeans themselves seem to be helpless, while the U.S. brings in new dependents such as the Duchy of Grand Fenwick, Montenegro. The U.S. has alliance commitments throughout the Middle East. We take care of the rich royals who sit in Riyadh as they oppress their own people. We have permanent nation building, 17 years in Afghanistan, trying to create democracy or something, whatever it is, in Kabul. The United States has enormous commitments around the world at a time in which it is bankrupt. And it is notably bankrupt under the GOP. The Republicans have simultaneously increased spending and cut taxes, which has advanced by at least 2 years, us coming to $1 trillion deficits without a financial crisis. At least Barack Obama could point to a financial crisis. There is none today. And we're talking about essentially $1 trillion deficit today, this year, and next year, and the year after. We have $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities, and those numbers will grow worse with entitlements. So over the long term, the U.S. is going to have to make some very clear political choices. Do the elderly of America living in assisted living want to give up their Medicare and their Social Security so that we can take care of foreign countries who would seem to have the wherewithal to defend themselves? I think these are choices that are going to be pushed by budgets, and that's a very bad way to do it. We need to make foreign policy decisions and build the military force structure to back them up, as opposed to allow finances to drive force structure. But if we don't make those choices, I think budgets are going to do so. So it requires us to start thinking about these alliances and to what extent they are sustainable. The challenge, of course, with the ROK is what does one do with an ROK that faces a nuclear North Korea? And I think even there, one can argue that if the U.S. wants to maintain a nuclear umbrella, it doesn't have to preserve troops on the peninsula, that indeed that enhances American vulnerabilities. One can imagine maintaining an umbrella without putting U.S. troops within convenient range of nuclear weapons from even short-range missiles from the north. There are certainly larger arguments in terms of Asia. I tend not to find them persuasive. I doubt, for example, that the ROK, the Blue House, would ever allow the United States to use military facilities in Korea to fight China over issues unrelated to the Korean Peninsula. I can imagine what President Moon would say if the U.S. asked to use those forces to bomb the Chinese to preserve Taiwan's independence. I think the answer would be, you must be out of your frigging mind. We're not going to make a permanent enemy of the country that's sitting there to our north that has a very long memory. So I think it's easy to overstate the role of America's presence in the Korean Peninsula for other reasons, stability and others, that a lot of that is speculation. And I think that the nuclear issue should bring this all vividly to our minds because it has dramatically increased the potential cost of the alliance. That is, as Lindsey Graham so elegantly put it, what's the big deal of a war in Korea? The war at least would be over there. It would not be, as he said, over here. The potential of North Korea having nuclear-tipped missiles that could hit the United States actually would bring the war over here. So the question is the United States prepared to maintain an alliance which might result in attacks on American homeland? Is the United States prepared to risk Los Angeles or Seattle or Portland to save Seoul? And that's a question that has to be asked because the alliance could lead to that. Even if it starts as a conventional war, imagine the situation of 1950. U.S. and ROK troops are advancing on the Yalu. The North Koreans have been decisively defeated, at which point the ultimatum comes from the North, which is you either withdraw your troops or we shoot our nukes off. We don't care what you do. Are we prepared to continue? The contingencies of a North that has some number of nuclear weapons, which we believe likely could reach the United States, all of which is contingent. Nevertheless, what risks are we prepared to take? What are our certainties? How much are we prepared to assume in terms of capabilities? It requires us to ask, are we prepared to sacrifice the American homeland to provide a defense for South Korea? I think it raises extraordinarily important issues for the U.S. We no longer can assume this is a conventional conflict that will be over there. South Korea will be the major battlefield. Some Americans will die, but the American homeland will be safe. We may not be living in that world. So it strikes me what to do. Well, the question then is what does one do with the alliance? It strikes me the first point would be anything we can do to get denuclearization would be useful. Now, I am skeptical. I have trouble imagining that the Supreme Leader, as he is called, has decided to create all of his nuclear weapons and missiles for the purpose of giving them away. I am skeptical. Nevertheless, if we think it's a possibility, certainly in alliance it would make sense to put that on the table as a mechanism to get verifiable denuclearization. Whether we think that will happen or not, if we believe there is a chance, we should do anything that we can to pursue that. And I think we have to understand the United States cannot assume that it gets denuclearization and gives nothing up, which as far as I can tell is a U.S. position, other than getting rid of sanctions. And of course, we shouldn't have to give up the alliance. That would be an outrage. Well, if we want them to give up their nuclear weapons, then it's not going to come free. The question is, what are we prepared to give? It strikes me that easily could be on the table. One could imagine, as I mentioned earlier, we could withdraw our conventional forces and modify the nuclear umbrella, maintain that. I think it would be still risky, but somewhat less riskier than having conventional forces and a conventional guarantee. It's also worth talking about the unthinkable for many people, but nevertheless, the question is, why is it unthinkable, which is ROK nukes? Of course, proliferation is not a good thing, but this is a world like our last presidential election. It's compared to what? You get one, you get another. Is it better for the United States to maintain a nuclear umbrella and be prepared to sacrifice and risk nuclear war for other countries, or would it be better if they had their own nuclear weapons? Downsides are obvious. spur other proliferation. It would create an extraordinary debate within Tokyo, I suspect, less stability perhaps in the region. On the other hand, it also might have a nice impact of constraining China. Frankly, I don't see why the United States should be the one, the famous incident where the Chinese general asked, whether we prepared to sacrifice Los Angeles for Taipei. Well, maybe it would be better if the Japanese were prepared to sacrifice Tokyo to protect Tokyo as opposed to America sacrifice Los Angeles to protect Tokyo, especially in a world in which America's allies understandably would question that. That is, whatever America says, if a crisis came, would an American president, in fact, take that step and be prepared to enter into a potential nuclear confrontation knowing the cost? Doesn't matter what the U.S. says, the pressures on a president would be extraordinary in both directions. Keep your word. On the other hand, don't sacrifice your own people. But it strikes me that, as unthinkable as it might be, the question is, again, compared to what? At the very least, it should be debated. We should think of this. That our nuclear umbrella is a good thing for the United States. Is there an alternative here? Because I think that unless we're prepared to risk war to take out North Korean nuclear weapons, they will have them. Now, we can hope that they don't develop effective, targetable long-range missiles that they actually can hit America with. We don't think they're quite there yet in terms of capabilities. Nevertheless, that's a thin reed to rest our hopes on. If we come to that world, the alliance looks a lot different than it does today. And I think we have to take that into consideration, ask the costs that we're prepared to undertake. And we need to rethink this very seriously. There are no good answers here, but it's not clear to me that maintaining an alliance that essentially is one-sided, imagine sitting in Seoul as the President of the United States, a rather unique figure, shall we say, is threatening to attack North Korea, recognizing what is likely to happen if that happens. Maybe the North Koreans would show great, judgment and reasonableness and restraint, perhaps, but I wouldn't want to bet my city on it. Then unfortunately for South Korea, then its future is in the hands of what Washington decides for its own reasons. A president advised by a U.S. senator who seriously says, well, we might have to go to war. Yeah, it'd be bad for the Japanese and the South Koreans, but at least the war would be over there. It would not be over here. That is not reassuring for South Koreans or Americans. So, thank you.
Thank you, Doug. We now have laid on the table a robust challenge to our extended deterrence guarantees and also the question of how much alliance is affordable. So, let's open it up to questions. Joe Bosco.
Joe Bosco, formerly with the Department of Defense. Mr. Bandow, it seems that the basic premise of your entire argument is that the world has changed dramatically since the 1950s. You say the Soviet Union is gone, Mao Zedong is gone, and we face a totally different set of challenges today. I would posit that maybe the world hasn't changed quite so much. You've got leaders in both Russia and China who want to restore the earlier grandeur of Joseph Stalin or Mao Zedong. And in fact, the policies that guide those governments are inherently hostile to the United States. So, has the world really changed that much? Don't we really have a geopolitical challenge on both the Korean Peninsula and from China and from Russia/Soviet Union regenerated that should inform our decisions on these alliances which served us well during the Cold War, during that period, and may well serve us well now?
I think the challenges are dramatically different. I think Russia is a great power all on 1914. It wants respect. It says, don't screw with us. We want stable borders. I don't see any ideological competition. Putin is an evil man, but it strikes me he's a rational man. I don't see him creating an empire. Getting some control over the Donbass, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia isn't much. I don't see him as having global ambitions that the Soviet Union had. I think that indeed, I think he can be constrained by the Europeans. I don't see him having any ability really to threaten the United States other than intervention, arguably, in elections, which of course the United States has routinely done in other countries as well. To me, that's the one vital national interest that is threatened, is our democratic system and having mucking around in that. But I don't see this threat in any way the same as it was under Stalin, Warsaw Pact, Red Army, and everything. And I think Xi Jinping's a nasty guy. I worry about the Chinese. I think they're much more serious of an issue than the Russians. Russia, I think, is the declining power that matters less. China, I think, matters more. I don't believe that the South Koreans are going to be helping us on other issues in the sense of risking their own country and an alliance in that sense. To me, perhaps the most important thing we could do is to stop pushing the Russians towards the Chinese. We've kind of reversed Richard Nixon's splitting them. I'd much prefer to see an effort to pull the Russians away. The Russians have their own issues with China, lots of reasons to fear China's activities in Asia. And even China, I think, is a very different player than under Mao Zedong, the Red Army, Red Guard, Cultural Revolution, everything that was going on. I think it's an issue where the big change, of course, are our allies. Of a South Korea, of a Japan, of a Europe, countries that have recovered from war, that are wealthy, that can build the militaries they need, that can defend their own interests. And we should, rather turning them into dependents and infants, we should expect them to do what's necessary by serious industrialized powers with serious interests that are being challenged by neighboring countries.
Gordon Chang.
I'm really sorry to ignore my friends Bruce and Yoon, but Doug's propositions are really important to discuss. It seems that assumption you're making is that if we're not involved and not an alliance partner with South Korea, that we can avoid conflict with China or North Korea. Recently, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been making the argument. Recently, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been making the argument.
Gordon, why don't you swap with him? Sorry about that.
Is making the argument that there is only one sovereign state in the world, and that happens to be China. And that raises the issue then, whether we can avoid conflict with China by merely pulling out of the region. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, it strikes me, pulling out in and of itself doesn't necessarily change the dynamic with China. There are a whole set of issues with China, the South China Sea, territorial claims, and other sorts of things. It strikes me that pulling out of Korea certainly reduces the likelihood of conflict with North Korea. It reduces that set of issues. I think the question of China is a complex one where I think the U.S. has to be prepared to defend its interests, but again, it needs to expect its allies to be much more active. If it comes to who defends the Senkaku Islands, it strikes me that's much more Japan than the United States. If the question of Scarborough Reef, the Philippines can't expect to borrow the U.S. Navy to defend territories that it does not itself have military wherewithal to defend. The question of how one deals with that, I think, becomes complex, but it's not helped by having troops unnecessarily in the Korean Peninsula. And the more we're there, the less likely our allies, I think, are to deal with those issues. We see activity in Japan and elsewhere in part because they're nervous that we might pull back. One of the strongest impetuses for them to do more is a realization they no longer can expect the United States to do so. And while I would not use the rhetoric that Donald Trump uses in almost every case, still to have a president suggesting that the future might not be one in which they can depend upon the United States military, I think is helpful in terms of causing them to rethink their own defense policies and what they need to do to ensure their independence in the face of a country like China, ruled by a man like Xi Jinping.
Danny Davis from Defense Priorities. Professor Sung, I got a question for you. You had mentioned in your opening comments that, if I understood correctly, that you talked about the history of conflict prior to 1945 in Korea, and then since that time it's been zero, etc. It seemed to imply that because the United States was there, that's why it had been zero, and if we leave, then that dynamic may return. But I noticed there's obviously a number of other countries in that area, like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, etc., who have borders with China, and they're not attacked, and they have their own defense here. Since economic power is the basis for like our national power, and certainly South Korea has one of the strongest in the world, and their military right now is pretty strong. If we left that, why would they not be able to successfully defend themselves as others. And then the real question is, does that mean the United States even has to stay there forever? Because at some point they're going to have to do their own security, even aside from the things that Doug talked about.
I take a rather amoral approach to the study of international relations. Please don't say immoral, but amoral. The U.S. is not responsible for any nation's sovereignty or security or democracy. I guess my view, which differs, which stands at variance with Mr. Bandow's, although I'm very, very sympathetic to and in support of Mr. Bandow's assumptions and analyses as to why the U.S. should withdraw. My views are that the probability of war increases in the wake of U.S. withdrawal, or to put it more frankly, U.S. abandonment of South Korea. As to the proposition that South Korea today is very different, which it of course is from 1950, that the South Koreans have a very capable military, yes. But the reality is, over the past 65 years, at no point since 1953 has South Korea or the United States shot back in the face of countless lethal, always controlled and limited, small-scale, but lethal attacks, killings of Americans and South Koreans for fear of escalation and Korean War II. And that has conditioned North Korea to assume that it can get away with murder, and it has. So with a nuclear-armed North Korea and no more U.S. support for the South, I think North Korea will be only more further emboldened to have its way with South Korea and to continue to resort to this violence campaign of calculated violence until South Korea is really obliterated, until the Republic of Korea no longer exists. As to Cambodia and other countries, the Korean Peninsula is unique in many ways because Koreans have a relatively high degree of ethnic homogeneity, have at least 2,000 years of recorded history. So the assumption that one day Korea should be reunited, that's deeply ingrained in the Korean DNA, although neither government, North Korea nor South Korea, has really tried very hard to seek about a peaceful reunification. So for North Korea having to contend with all the Kims and Lees across the border, where you have an incomparably richer, freer Korean state that's a magnet to your own people, you have a problem. It's an existential threat.
Like Doug said, where the removal of the troops doesn't necessarily mean the removal of the nuclear support to South Korea. And with South Korea having, I don't even know what his orders of magnitude larger economy, why would they be at a disadvantage over North Korea, which has a substantial, I mean a tiny percentage of the economy base from which they could even make a national business? It seems like with that, the South Korea would still be
the economic disparity is the biggest in the world between two neighbors contiguously joined by land. At no other place in the world do you see such a huge income gap between two neighboring states. At least 50 times South Korea is richer than the North. That actually has negative implications in my view for South Korea. Because South Korea has grown so rich, there is simply no stomach to escalate tension with North Korea. There's just too much on the line, and that favors North Korea's campaign of calculated provocations.
Kurt.
Yes, sir. Kurt Couchman with Defense Priorities. I wanted to try to bridge Bruce and Doug a little bit. Bruce, you talked a lot about military reforms and different ways of restructuring the way that we interact with the Republic of Korea. And Doug, you talked about the changes in the world and how that should lead us to question at least the way that we're conducting the alliance, if not the alliance itself. And it seems that because of the fiscal pressures that Doug brought up, we may be forced at some point into removing at least some of our troops from various places in the world where people are accustomed to them being. And the fear is that by doing so precipitously, we may in fact foment instability just simply because of the quick withdrawal. And so based on that, shouldn't we be focusing on getting our allies to, if not develop, at least have their own command and control, their own ISR that are independent of the United States, help them develop that capability and even help them maintain it into the future so that if we do have to pull back, then they still have the capability to deal with whatever security threats come their way?
I mean, a couple points. If the idea we remove our troops from overseas as part of saving money, well, they're going to cost more in the U.S. because we're not getting offset by the allies. I mean, South Korea pays, 48% of the U.S. costs of deploying our forces overseas. We wouldn't get that plus up if they move back to some base in the U.S. And as General Gregson pointed out, the Pyeongtaek base was 90% paid for by South Korea. In fact, in the U.S. Pacific Theater military construction budget of $39 billion, South Korea and Japan are paying $32 billion of that, including them paying for construction in Guam, which clearly is not either Japanese or Korean soil. So I think if you remove the forces as a cost saving, it's not going to happen. You'd have to eliminate them from the U.S. armed forces. Also, I think if we are obligated to defend South Korea, not just against nuclear attacks, but against any attack. So if you don't have troops there, I think it increases the potential that North Korea feels it can intimidate or coerce or even engage in coercive diplomacy against South Korea. You need boots on the ground to show, I think, real resolve and real commitment. We did that in Europe during the Cold War. So when people talk about putting U.S. forces at risk, would we really trade L.A. for Seoul? We were willing to risk L.A., L.A., New York, and Washington for Bonn, Paris, and London during the Cold War. I think that is what showed U.S. resolve, and what deterred the Soviets from trying to move westward. So, I think if we pull out the forces prematurely, then I think it could lead to increased potential for hostilities. Now, that doesn't mean we leave them for the next 1,000 years, but it also means you don't pull them out tomorrow. Now, where is the point between 1,000 years and tomorrow? That's a matter of debate. But in order, there is a plan for OPCON transfer. It's no longer calendar driven, it's capabilities driven. So sort of behind the scenes, there's a whole list of capabilities and checklists and timelines that are in place for a measurable point where in the future South Korea could take over OPCON. And as General Brooks said this week or last week, they're not there yet. So I think the goal is to have our allies stand on their own, but I don't think they're there yet. And also, we are a Pacific nation, and so we need to have, I think it's in our own interest to have forces overseas to maintain the peace in the neighborhoods.
Let me push just a little bit on some larger issues that we've touched on just a little bit here, but maybe not enough. With our talk about putting nuclear weapons back into South Korea and potentially Japan, are we talking about declaring an end of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? And if so, are we looking at a widely proliferated world? And if so, is that in our favor? Question. The other one would be with the talk of walking away from alliances, relying on our current allies to do much more to defend themselves. Are we walking away from the liberal international order that we did so much to create in the wake of World War II that so far has served us pretty well? And does that create a more Hobbesian world of, as Dr. Sung alluded to, Hobbesian world of the larger countries bullying and swallowing and coercing the smaller countries? I'll just leave that one on the table. And Doug, you were going to say something earlier.
Yeah, look, I think in dealing with your alliances, you have to take into account interest at stake. In the Cold War, Europe was weak, and we viewed it as vital to deny the Soviets control of Eurasia. That's why we were willing to threaten and use extended deterrence. Korea Peninsula today doesn't have that same level of interest, and it also is far more wealthy and powerful than the North. It should be militarily. It's a very different set of circumstances. I do think that ending an alliance doesn't mean you can't have military cooperation. There's no reason you can't work together on issues of mutual interest. The challenge, for example, we see in Europe is that we get the Europeans into a war that doesn't interest them, Afghanistan. They get us into a war that shouldn't interest us, Libya. It's not at all clear that an alliance like that is drawing, supporting the security of both sides. It may very well be supporting the insecurity of both sides. I think you raise a very important issue in terms of how one gets out, and it does strike me you don't do it immediately. The challenge here is I wrote my book, Tripwire, a long time ago, 20-odd years ago, and I had one section where I just listed all of the predictions of all sorts of different American and South Korean figures who would say, well, in 3 or 4 years, South Korea can take care of itself. And then, 3 or 4 years later went by, and they would say, in 3 or 4 years. And I had a long list of these. There is no reason why the ROK would ever want to be defense independent. Understandably, I don't criticize. But I think we have to recognize that absent setting some kind of final time and then working together during the interim, you're never going to get to an endpoint. I think Bruce is right. The critical question is reducing force structure. If you have more commitments, you have to have more forces. That's a reality. If you cut back on commitments, you can cut back on force structure. That's where you save the money. It's not location. It's a question of having the units. If you want to defend much of the known world, you have to have a military that's sizable, indeed probably bigger than the one we have today. It's going to be expensive. You have to make that decision. Are you prepared to have that kind of a foreign policy? And then you have to finance that foreign policy. Military budget is the price of your foreign policy. We need to keep those in sync. I think that the question of being obligated to defend the South Koreans, to me, that's one reason why you have to look at the alliance and not just deployments. What kind of obligations do we want to keep? The fact we've done it for 65 years doesn't mean we have to do it for another 65 years. We need to make decisions based upon America's interest there. And yes, I think, Kurt, you're right that there are lots of things we can do to assist countries in a transition. We don't want to direct them. I think this is a question of them making decisions in terms of their own defense, their own resources, their own interests. We should be prepared to assist them during the transition as opposed to directing them. One of the problems of alliances is we try to direct our allies, demand how much they spend, get mad at them when they don't. I don't think the Europeans are afraid of, most of them aren't afraid of Russia. That's why they spend so little. Hectoring them doesn't help. Getting out of the alliance changes that relationship.
I have Tom Hammes, Scott Snyder, and Joe Bosco. Go ahead, please.
When President Nixon removed an entire division in 1970 and 71, reducing the number of U.S. troops in the South from 63,000 to 43,000, the South Koreans were quite concerned. And during the Park Chung-hee years, throughout the 1970s, South Korea increased its defense budget as a share of the GDP from 4% to 6%. So you do see, historically, an example of South Korea coping with the change. However, I think the Chinese would not just turn a blind eye in the wake of U.S. withdrawal from South Korea in the future as South Korea tries to procure sensitive weapons systems to bolster its defense capabilities. China has been sanctioning Seoul since 1392, since the founding of the Joseon dynasty with its capital city in Seoul. China has been sanctioning Korea with impunity while subsidizing North Korea with devotion since 1948. With respect to THAAD deployment, a single battery, we see China very casually sanctioning South Korea while subsidizing, continuing to violate UN sanctions against North Korea and subsidizing the North. So I think the prospects for even greater tension, whether it's trade relations, economic issues, or security issues between the United States and China would also increase in the wake of U.S. withdrawal from South Korea.
Doesn't that then mean that the United States has to stay there forever? And if not, what would be the conditions that would allow that, given all the things you talked about?
North Korean regime going away.
Yeah, I'm not deterministic. I guess, politically deterministic, but I'm not saying that U.S. has to forever carry the burden. But I think the U.S. needs to figure out a practical way of increasing for China the cost of continuing to coddle North Korea. And as we saw in the morning session, as Gordon mentioned, there are lots of things that the U.S. could do with respect to Chinese entities, including the 4 biggest banks. And historically, those 4 banks, China Industrial Commercial Bank, Agriculture, Construction, and Bank of China, have severed their financial relations with North Korean banks designated by the Treasury Department in 1990, in the case of Banco Delta Asia, September 2005, and also in the wake of Treasury's designation of North Korea's foreign trade bank in the wake of North Korea's third nuclear test in February 2013. So the Chinese are very practical. They will complain, of course, but they will pay the fine, whether it's 10 billion or 20 billion. The US fined the biggest bank in France $9 billion for violating US laws on Iran, Cuba, Sudan sanctions. The bank paid. That was a settlement.
Tom Hammes, NDU.
I think what concerns me about the discussion about whether Korea can take care of itself is that it's being discussed in isolation. And I think the key issue is not so much the alliance in Asia, but or the alliance with Korea, but the structure of Asia. If we turn to the Koreans and say we're leaving, and even if we string it out over time and provide nukes, etc., then the question for the Japanese is, do we stay on side with the Americans or not? And if we are going to make that decision, then we've decided we're withdrawing from Asia. And I would say that's a discussion you can have, but we can't talk about it country by country. We have to talk about it by the structure of Asia, and to a certain degree, Europe, because we have the same problem with NATO in not carrying. So I would just like to see the discussion elevated from just talking about Korea to what's the impact on U.S. strategic situation in Asia, and is that a good thing if we're out of Asia or a bad thing?
Just like to follow up on that.
Yeah. Hi, Doug.
Hi there, how are you?
It's been a while, but boy, the conservative libertarian debates of old just rolling around here. But,
Some things are classic.
Exactly.
But I think Dr. Hammes makes a wonderful point, and I'd just like to put an even finer point on it for you, Doug. Look, we're going to be facing a globally deployed, nuclear-armed bases in every continent, hopefully except ours, Chinese military in a decade, maybe a little longer, and the game of hit the gopher at the arcade is that's going to be our foreign policy. All these crises, Chinese generated, are going to be popping up, and decisions are going to have to be made. And when a North Korean missile is launched at the United States, is it going to be better or worse to defend the United States that a radar in Korea and a radar in Japan are coordinated to help us shoot down that missile or its multiple warheads? And I mean, if that is the case, then does it matter? Is it of value that we have invested these decades in these alliance relationships that would help us to engineer solutions to a global Chinese capability that's going to be coming at us from all different directions?
Let me take the next two questions from the folks on the list, Scott Snyder and Joe Bosco, and then I'll turn to the panel for responses and closing remarks, starting with Bruce, who you all have left off a hook here for most of the time. Scott?
Just going
Or,
to...
no. Scott, please, first.
Yeah, I'm just going to build on this set of questions, really, because what I'm interested in is setting aside North Korea to the extent that we can. What is the driving set of shared threats or shared interests that the U.S.-Korea alliance would contribute to as part of U.S. policy in East Asia, and is it equipped to do so?
Thank you. And Joe?
Going back briefly, Doug, to your point about what's changed and what has not changed. What has changed on the Korean Peninsula, of course, is that South Korea is 50 times the economy of North Korea. What hasn't changed is if there's a threat to North Korea, China, the big brother, will step in. So when you talk about South Korea being capable of wielding its might against North Korea, you've got to factor in what role will China play in such a conflict. We know what it did in 1950. It poured in several 100,000 troops.
Okay, with nobody urgently raising a two-fingered intervention, Bruce, the
I
first
think
summary is yours, and then we'll go to Doug, and then the Professor.
Yeah, oftentimes when we look at the alliance, not only South Korea but NATO and stuff, there's sort of okay, how do we spur our allies to do more? And there's sort of that question of should it be tough love? Sort of like if you think of a parent with an unruly teenager, it's like, okay, you didn't do what I want, so you're out on the street. Do you just pull your forces out? Do you just say we're not going to do anything? And the risk is otherwise the teenager or the ally just calls your bluff and continues to have you foot most of the bill. I mean, so you can debate on how to get them to do more, but I think if as we've sort of expanded it to a broader role of the question of alliances, it's sort of like thinking of having policemen deployed in a city, including in bad neighborhoods. You could say that's pretty expensive. If we just bring all those policemen back to police headquarters, they're safer. Now the neighborhoods aren't, but the policemen are safer. And then if they're just sitting at home in the police station, why not cut half or why not cut all of them? It's a lot cheaper, and those policemen are safe, and the police headquarters might be safe. But you've just kind of written off the neighborhoods. Now you could say, well, they're not really part of my city; they're part of another city. They should protect themselves. Also it's. It seems like you go down the path of where is the end point of the discussion. It's like, seems to be, why have any alliances? I mean, it seems like that's where we're going with the discussion. Don't have any alliances. Don't put your country at risk. Don't put your people at risk for anyone else. And then if you're not going to defend them, well, then why do you need any kind of military other than sort of, strengthened border patrol or missile defense? I'd argue in the 1930s, when we were isolationist, we withdrew back into our castle, we raised the drawbridge, said to hell the rest of the world. It didn't work out so well. Neither did 1950, when we sort of suggested that Korea, you're on your own. Well, that didn't work out too well for us. I think pulling out of NATO, pulling out of South Korea or Japan, as I said before, I think it increases the potential for hostilities, or it increases the potential for a world that we don't like. If you have weak nations facing armed competitors and enemies, they may feel that, well, they either have to defend themselves or they accommodate themselves. Then you have Finlandization of your allies. So South Korea comes under sort of North Korean threat or Chinese influence. The same with Europe. So I think the U.S. is a unique nation in that we look beyond our own strategic objectives and look out for what's good for the common good. And I think it's also in our strategic interest to have stable, safe Europe and Asia.
Doug, 2 minutes, please.
Well, I think when it comes down to is primarily not neighborhoods, but the nation, the question of defending Americans and their own constitutional order and their lives. And one can be concerned about others, but one shouldn't treat defense as a matter of charity. And if other countries don't want to defend themselves, it's not a responsibility of the United States to do so, at least if there's no vital interest in the United States in doing so. To me, that's where the difference is from the Cold War, is that we faced a hegemonic threat that was aggressive, that was threatening, that was allied around the world. We had to defend countries that were war-torn, that were weak, that were in certain cases helpless. Today, all of that, I think, has changed and changed very dramatically. To my mind, the critical question then is, how do you deal with potential threats? And frankly, a world in which Japan and South Korea have nuclear weapons might very well be a better world in dealing with the China that Gordon believes we will be dealing with. And frankly, a Europe that does more, a Germany that spends more than 1.2% of GDP would be much better in dealing with Europe. They will not, as long as we do so. They will not. And it doesn't matter if we beg. It doesn't matter if we demand. It doesn't matter if we cry. What doesn't matter? They will not, because they have no reason to do so. So the question then is, how do you try to get other countries to do more? Necessity is the most powerful issue. Question of whether the North Koreans shoot a missile off at us, my argument is that if we don't have an alliance with South Korea, troops there, and involvement, they aren't likely to shoot a nuclear missile off at us because they care about us because we are there, because we're in their neighborhood with a military threat to them. They have no interest in starting a war with us in which they would be flattened, destroyed. I don't believe that Kim Jong-un wants his virgins in the next world. I think he likes them in today's world.
Professor, you have the honor of closing remarks.
Thank you. When we hear the phrase denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, I find it very odd. We don't say North Korea, but we oblige North Korea's insistence. We call it the Korean Peninsula. The North Koreans will tell us when they feel like it what they exactly mean by that. They mean not only dislodging the US from the peninsula, but also the abrogation of the US-Japan alliance. So unless the United States pulls troops from South Korea and Japan, North Korea will remain North Korea, resorting to provocations, calculated provocations, and then following up with a carrot, a post-provocation peace ploy, and becoming even a greater threat to the United States. The United States fought against Japan in World War II, among other reasons, to defend its interests in China. And then in the Korean War, the US fought against China and North Korea to really principally to defend Japan. I think that incentive will remain in place for the foreseeable future, for decades, if not a century, to protect US interests in Japan. And I think that interest will be jeopardized were the US to withdraw from the South and leave Japan more vulnerable to North Korea's designs.
Well stated. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel members.
Thank you. Pleasure. And we'll see everybody back at 2:45 for the